$200 cash laid flat on the hood of a county surveyor's truck for a strip of land that flooded every spring and grew nothing but cattails and mosquitoes. That was the sight that made the men outside the Hollisburg feed store stop chewing their coffee stirs and turn to watch. They had seen a lot of fools come through in their time, and they had a way of recognizing one at 40 yards. The girl doing the paying was small and unhurried, her hair pulled back with a rubber band that had once held a bunch of asparagus, and she counted the bills out slow. Not because she couldn't count fast, but because she wanted to be sure the man watching her understood the money was real. The land she was buying sat down in the low bend of the Sable River where it slowed and spread and gave up whatever it was carrying, so that every March the water came up over the road and turned 40 acres of somebody's dream into a shallow brown lake full of drowned fence posts. Nobody had farmed it in 2 decades. The last man to try had planted soybeans and watched them rot, and after him the county took it for back taxes and had been trying to unload it ever since at any price a living person would agree to. The price a living person would agree to, it turned out, was $200, and the living person was Marley Vance, 19 years old, who had arrived in town 3 weeks earlier with a duffel bag and a dead woman's house key. If you have ever been told that something you own, something you love, or something you are is worth less than it truly is, do me a small favor before we go on. Tap the like button so this story reaches somebody else who has been underestimated, and leave a comment telling me the name of the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this reaches. Now let me take you back to the muddy bend of the Sable River, because the men laughing on that porch had no idea what they were looking at. What they were looking at was a girl who had learned to be quiet in rooms where nobody wanted her opinion. Marley had grown up 200 miles east in a rented duplex, with a mother who worked doubles and a father who was mostly a name on an envelope. And the one steady thing in all those shifting years had been the 2 weeks each summer she was shipped out to her great-aunt Odette's place on the edge of Hollisburg County. Odette Rue was her grandmother's sister, a woman built like a fence post and about as talkative, who wore men's canvas trousers and rubber boots and a straw hat gone soft at the brim, and who wore all of it without the smallest flicker of self-consciousness because she had earned every stitch of it across 70-odd years of getting up before the sun. Odette raised a little of everything and a lot of nothing in particular. She had chickens and a milk goat and a garden that fed half the road, and down at the bottom of her property, where her land shaded into the county's flooded strip, she had kept ducks, not for show, not for pets. She kept a small flock of them the way other people keep a habit they can't explain. And every one of those 2-week summers Marley had followed the old woman down to the water's edge in the gray light and watched the birds work the shallows, and something in her had gone still and satisfied in a way nothing else in her life ever managed. Odette died in February, quietly, in the chair by her stove, and left the house and its 4 dry acres to the great niece who had written her letters. Marley read the notice from the lawyer 3 times, quit the grocery job she hated, and drove west with everything she owned rattling in the trunk. She did not have a plan. She would tell people later that she came back not because she had figured anything out, but because it was the only place on earth where she had ever felt like she was standing on ground that would hold her. When she walked into Odette's kitchen the first evening, the wood stove was cold, and the calendar on the wall was still turned to February, and taped to the inside of the pantry door, where Odette had kept it for reasons no one had ever asked her about, was a note in a man's slanting hand that read, "The low water is the richest water. Don't let them talk you out of the bottom." Marley did not know who had written it. She did not know what it meant. She left it where it was. For the first week she did nothing but walk. She walked the 4 dry acres, and then she walked down to where the land dropped away into the flooded bottom, and she stood at the edge of that brown water for a long time, long enough that a heron decided she was furniture and went back to fishing, and she looked at the drowned strip the way she looked at everything, which was slowly, without saying a word, turning it over in her mind before she let her hands touch it. Odette's ducks were still there, 9 of them, a mixed and shabby flock that had wintered on their own and greeted her arrival with total indifference, and they spent their days working that flooded ground with a patience she recognized, dabbling in the shallows, tipping bottoms up in the muck, walking the mud flats where the water had drawn back, eating things she couldn't see, and getting fat on ground that everyone in the county agreed was worthless. She watched them do it for 3 mornings straight before the thought arrived, and when it arrived, it did not announce itself. It came the way water comes up in spring, from underneath, so slow you don't notice until your boots are wet. The county still owned the flooded 40. Marley drove into Hollisburg on the 4th morning and asked at the courthouse what it would take to buy the bottom, and the clerk, a heavy-set man named Del Prewitt, who had never once in his life been asked that question, laughed out loud and then apologized and then told her the truth, which was that the county would take almost anything to be rid of it because it couldn't be built on, couldn't be reliably farmed, and cost the money to carry. He said the last serious offer had been $400 and it had fallen through when the buyer's wife found out. He said, mostly to be kind, that she should think it over. Marley said she had thought it over. She put $200 on the surveyor's truck outside the feed store because that was where the paperwork got signed, and Wendell Oakes, who owned the biggest dry crop land spread in the township and considered himself the local authority on what dirt was worth, watched the whole transaction from his rocking chair and said, loud enough for her to hear, that a person could set $200 on fire and at least get warm from it. His friends laughed. Marley folded the receipt into the pocket of her jacket and drove home. And behind her the men agreed among themselves that the girl wouldn't last the summer, that the bottom would take her money the way it had taken everyone else's, and that this was the last anybody would hear of it. They were, every one of them, wrong, but it would take 3 years for them to find out, and the finding out would begin with something none of them thought to watch: the ducks. She started with the 9 birds she already had. That was all. Marley had grown up poor enough to distrust borrowed money on a cellular level, and she had watched what debt did to her mother's face at the kitchen table on the 1st of every month. So when the thought came to her that she might make something of the bottom, her first instinct was not to expand, but to understand. She spent the rest of that spring simply watching what the ducks did with the flooded ground, and she began keeping a notebook, a plain spiral thing she bought at the drugstore, in which she wrote down everything: what the water level was each morning, where the birds fed, what they refused to eat, how the mud looked after they'd worked it, how many eggs the 4 hens among them laid, and where they hid the nests. She wrote in the small, careful hand of someone who had never had anyone check her homework and had learned to check it herself. And somewhere in that first month she went back to the note taped inside the pantry door and read it again. The low water is the richest water. Don't let them talk you out of the bottom. And she carried it out to the edge of the flooded 40 and stood there holding it. And for the first time it began to sound less like a stranger's riddle and more like an instruction from someone who had known this exact ground. She found out who had written it by accident, the way she found out most things, by being quiet in a room until people forgot she was listening. Odette's oldest friend was a woman named Cleora Basque, who ran the little post office annex out of the front of her house on Tinsmith Road, and Cleora, when Marley came in to change her mailing address, took one look at her and started to cry, and then got over it, and then talked for 40 minutes without much prompting. She said Marley had her great-aunt's stillness. She said Odette had come to that land as a young bride in 1951 with a husband named Asa Rue, a man who had grown up in the river bottoms of 2 counties over, and who understood flooded ground the way other men understood dry, and that Asa had wanted to raise ducks on the bottom from the very beginning, and had built the first flock up by hand, and had been laughed at by the same kind of men who were laughing at Marley now. Asa Rue had died young, in 1968, of a heart that quit in the field, and after him Odette had kept the ducks going out of loyalty more than ambition, never expanding, never explaining, just keeping the flame lit on the low water, because her husband had asked her to. The note in the pantry, Cleora said, was Ace's hand. Odette had moved it from house to barn to pantry across 54 years and never once let it fade. Marley drove home from the post office with her jaws set in a way that would have been familiar to anyone who had known the old man. And that evening, she took the notebook down to the water and wrote across the top of a fresh page the words her great-uncle had left, and under them she wrote her own line, the one she would come back to again and again in the years ahead, when everything was hard. Worth doesn't argue, it just waits. She did not know yet how long the waiting would be. The waiting, as it happened, was measured in eggs first. By early May, the 4 hens were laying in earnest, tucked into the reeds along the high edge of the bottom, and Marley gathered them each morning into a wire basket and found herself within a week with more duck eggs than one 19-year-old could eat. Duck eggs are richer than hen eggs, larger, with a yolk that stands up gold and heavy, and there is a certain kind of cook who will drive across a county for them and pay double. But Marley didn't know that yet, so she did the only thing that made sense to her, which was to take a dozen into Hollisburg and offer them at the little grocery on the square. The owner, a careful man named Pruitt Salk, who had run the store since his father died and who priced everything to the penny, held one of the eggs up to the window light and turned it over and said he'd take the dozen on consignment and see if anything moved. Nothing moved for 4 days. On the 5th day, a woman named Iris Finn, who cooked at the Methodist camp out on Revelle Creek and baked for every funeral in 3 townships, came in for flour and saw the duck eggs and bought all 12, and came back the next week and asked if there were more, because her pound cakes had come out of the oven taller and richer than they had in 30 years, and the women at the church had noticed. That was the first sale that meant anything, and Marley wrote it in the notebook without ceremony, a single line. Iris Finn, 1 dozen, wants standing order. It did not feel like a triumph. It felt like a door opening onto a hallway she couldn't see the end of. But eggs were only the beginning of what the bottom was teaching her, and it was Odette's neighbor to the north, a leathery old man named Burl Toomey, who had farmed dry corn his whole life and had opinions about everything, who accidentally handed her the second half of the idea. Burl came down the fence line one June evening to tell her, in the neighborly way of men who mean it as a warning, that she was wasting her time. He said the bottom was worthless because you couldn't grow a crop on it, and that his own father had said so, and that if the ground could have made money, somebody would have made it by now. He leaned on the fence and gestured at the ducks working the mudflat and said the only thing that dirt would ever produce was mosquitoes and disappointment. And then, because he could not help himself, he added that it was a shame, because the soil down in that bottom was black as coffee grounds, and probably the best in the county if a man could only keep the water off it. Marley looked at the black mud where the ducks had been working, mud so dark and fine it looked like something you could eat. And she looked at the ducks, and she did not say anything, because she had just understood something Burl had said without meaning to. The water wasn't the problem. The water was the reason the soil was that rich. The flooding that everyone cursed was the same flooding that laid down a new inch of river silt every spring, and the ducks, tramping and dabbling and fertilizing that silt all summer, were building topsoil the way factories build steel. The bottom wasn't worthless despite the flood. It was priceless because of it. She thanked Burl for coming by. He went home believing he had talked sense into her, and told his wife over supper that the girl had finally seemed to understand she was licked. She spent the rest of that first summer building nothing but understanding. She let the flock grow on its own. A duck hen will hatch a clutch if you leave her the reeds to hide in. And by August, the 9 birds had become 22, and the 22 worked the bottom in a loose gray tide that moved with the water as it drew down through the dry months. And everywhere they worked, the ground came up softer and blacker behind them. Marley started fencing, not to keep the ducks in, but to divide the bottom into sections she could rest and rotate, an idea that came to her from watching how the birds ruined a patch if they stayed on it too long and healed it if she moved them off. She had no money for real fence, so she cut willow from the high ground and wove it, the way she'd seen a picture of once, and the willow took root where she planted it and grew, so that her fences got stronger every year instead of weaker, which is the kind of thing that happens when you build with living material because you can't afford dead. By the time the first cold came, the bottom that had been a brown mosquito swamp in March was a mosaic of black earth and green regrowth and clean water, and it produced, that autumn, more duck eggs than Pruitt Salk's little store could sell, so that Marley had to start driving them 30 miles to the farmer's market in the county seat, where a chef from a restaurant she'd never heard of bought her entire stock and gave her a phone number and told her to call him the day she had more. The chef's name was Desmond Oughton, and he ran a place in the county seat that people drove 2 hours to eat at. And he had been looking, he told her on the phone in November, for exactly the kind of duck eggs she was bringing him for the better part of a decade. He asked her what she fed the birds. She told him the truth, that she fed them almost nothing, that they fed themselves off the bottom, off the silt and the snails, and the wild rice and the green shoots that came up in the water, and that this was why the eggs tasted the way they did. There was a silence on the line, the particular silence of a professional recognizing that he has stumbled onto something rare. And then Desmond asked her whether she had ever considered selling the birds themselves. The meat, because a duck raised the way she was raising hers, wild-fed on flooded ground, would be worth more to him than anything he could get from a commercial grower, and he would take every bird she could raise and pay her a price that made her sit down at the kitchen table. Marley did not say yes right away. She said she would think about it, which was true. And she thought about it for 3 weeks, walking the frozen edge of the bottom in the early dark with her notebook in her coat. And what she thought about was not the money, though the money was real, but whether she could raise more birds without turning the bottom into the kind of place that killed the very thing that made it valuable. She decided she could, if she let the demand pull her forward instead of chasing it, if she built slow, if she never took on a bird more than the bottom could feed. She called Desmond back in December and told him she'd have birds for him in the spring, and not before, and he said he'd wait. And the way he said it told her he understood something the men on the feed store porch never would. The spring flood came in March exactly as it always had, and this time Marley stood on the road and watched the brown water come up over the low ground and did not feel the dread that had settled on every previous owner of that land. She had come to understand the flood as the engine of the whole enterprise, and she had built everything to ride it rather than fight it. The willow fences bent and held. The flock moved to the high edge and waited it out. And when the water drew back in April, it left behind, as it always had, a fresh skim of the blackest silt in the county, laid down free of charge on ground that everyone still believed was cursed. She turned the ducks loose on it, and they went to work, and by that second summer, the flock had grown to better than 100 birds, hatched from her own hens because she would not spend money on stock she could raise, and the bottom had grown lush in a way that made strangers slow their trucks on the road to look. She sold eggs to Pruitt Salk and to Iris Finn, and to a growing list of home cooks who had heard from other home cooks, and she began driving birds to Desmond Oughton in the county seat, dressed and cleaned by her own hand at the kitchen sink in the gray mornings. And the checks she brought home were larger than anything anyone in her family had earned in a single week for as far back as she could count. She did not tell anyone in Hollisburg what she was making. She wrote it in the notebook and kept the notebook in a coffee can on the shelf where Isa's note had once hung, because she'd moved the note into the notebook by then, taped to the inside cover, so the old man's hand wrote along with everything she recorded. Word of what was happening down on the Sable River bottom traveled the way all real news travels in a small place, which is not through advertisement but through the gossip hub. And the gossip hub in Hollisburg was the gas station out on the state road run by a talkative young man named Corbin Sleeth, who knew everybody's business because everybody stopped for gas and couldn't help talking to him. Corbin had a cousin who cooked at Desmond Otten's restaurant, and the cousin let slip what the restaurant was paying for the wild-fed ducks that came out of a certain flooded bottom in Hollisburg County, and Corbin, who could not keep a secret if his life depended on it, mentioned the number to a customer who mentioned it to Wendell Oaks, who did not believe it. Wendell Oaks, you will remember, was the big dry cropland man who had told Marley she might as well set her $200 on fire. And hearing the number Corbin was repeating, he came out to the bottom himself on a pretext of neighborliness and stood at the edge of Marley's willow fence and looked at the 100-odd ducks working the black ground and did the arithmetic in his head, and his face, Marley noticed, went through several weathers at once. He asked her a few questions in the tone of a man who wants to catch you in a lie, and she answered them plainly, and every answer only made the arithmetic worse for him, because it turned out the girl had spent almost nothing. No seed, no equipment, no borrowed money, no hired hands, and was clearing more off $200 of flooded ground than Wendell cleared off some of his dry quarter sections after inputs. He left without saying much. He told the men on the porch that evening that the girl had gotten lucky and it wouldn't hold, that a duck operation was a fragile thing and one bad year of disease or flood would wipe her out, and this became the new thesis, repeated up and down the county, that it wouldn't hold, that it was a fluke, that the bottom would take her in the end the way it took everyone. It was the kind of prediction men make to comfort themselves, and like the first one, it was wrong, but Marley never argued with it, because she had written in her notebook long before that Worth doesn't argue, it just waits, and she was content to let the waiting do her arguing for her. What held her operation together through those years was not luck, and it was not scale. It was the same patient attention she'd started with, extended and deepened until it covered everything. She read old agricultural bulletins she found in a box in Odette's attic, county extension pamphlets from the 1950s that had belonged to Osaroo and that were full of the old man's pencil notes in the margins. And in one of them, next to a paragraph about waterfowl on managed wetland, she found Asa had written the same line that was taped in the pantry. The low water is the richest water, as though he'd been quoting himself, or perhaps quoting whoever he'd learned it from. She began to feel, working the bottom in the early mornings, that she was not the first person to have understood this ground, but only the first in 2 generations to have been stubborn enough to act on it. And this gave her a kind of steadiness that the men on the porch mistook for arrogance, and that was actually closer to grief. The grief of realizing how much good knowledge dies unused because the people who hold it get laughed off their own land. She kept the flock healthy by keeping it moving and by never crowding it, and she kept it fed by letting the bottom do the feeding, and she kept it wild in the way that made the meat worth what Desmond paid by refusing to bring the birds up to the barn and finish them on grain the way every efficiency-minded person told her she should. When a hard winter killed some of the flock one January, she did not panic, and she did not borrow to replace them. She let the survivors rebuild in the spring, and they did, because the ground could carry them. And the loss taught her exactly how many birds the bottom could hold in a lean year, a number she wrote in the notebook and never again exceeded. And this discipline, building only to the size the land could feed even in its worst year, was the whole secret of why her operation held when Wendell Oaks kept predicting it would fail. By the 3rd spring, the eggs and the birds together had made Marley something she had never in her life expected to be, which was a person other people came to for advice, and she found she did not much like it and did not much refuse it either. Iris Fenn had started selling her own baked goods at the county market on the strength of Marley's eggs, and told everyone who asked exactly where the eggs came from, so that the name of the flooded bottom on the Sable River began to mean something specific and good in kitchens across 3 counties. Corbin Sleeth at the gas station had appointed himself the flock's unofficial publicist, and would tell any traveler who'd listen about the girl who bought worthless swampland for $200 and turned it into the richest acre in the township, and travelers being what they are, some of them drove out to see it, and a few of them wanted to buy eggs off the tailgate, and Marlee let them, because a sale was a sale and she'd never turned down honest money in her life. A teenage boy from down the road named Tobias Marsh started coming by after school to help her clean and pack, working for eggs at first and then for wages once she could afford them. And he was the first person she'd ever hired, and she taught him the way Odette had taught her, which was mostly by letting him watch and staying quiet until he got it wrong and then showing him once. Desmond Oughton put her ducks on his menu by name, listed them as coming from the Sable Bottom, and food writers who came to review the restaurant wrote about the ducks, and one of them drove out to Hollisburg to see the place for herself and wrote a long piece about a 19-year-old, 21 by then, who had understood a piece of drowned land that a whole county had written off. The piece ran in a paper people in the county seat actually read, and after it ran, the men on the feed store porch stopped saying it wouldn't hold, because it plainly had held, and they cast around for a new thing to say, and for a while they didn't say much of anything at all. The person that piece changed most was not Marlee, who read it once and set it aside because she had eggs to pack, but Wendell Ox, who read it 4 times and then could not sleep. Wendell was not a cruel man, only a conventional one, a man who had spent 60 years believing that the worth of ground was a settled fact you inherited from your father and did not have to think about. And the sight of a girl overturning that belief on $200 unsettled something in him that ran deeper than money. He owned, it turned out, a piece of Bottomland himself, a low, wet corner of his big spread down where a creek fed into the Sable. 40 acres he had cursed and drained and cursed again for 30 years, ground he'd have been glad to give away if anyone had wanted it. He came out to Marlee's place on a still October evening, alone, no pretext this time, and stood at the willow fence for a long while before he said anything. And what he finally said was not an apology in so many words, because men like Wendell do not make a large production out of being wrong, but it was as close as he had in him. He said he'd been thinking that his own low corner might grow ducks the way hers did, and that he didn't know the first thing about it, and that he understood he had no right to ask her anything after what he'd said about her money, but that he was asking anyway. Marlee looked at him for a long beat, the way she looked at everything before she acted, and then she said she'd come see his corner in the morning. She did not gloat. She did not remind him of the fire he'd told her she should set her $200 to. She simply drove out the next day, walked his wet 40, told him where the water sat and where the silt laid down and how many birds it might carry in a lean year, and left him with a page torn out of a fresh notebook covered in her small, careful hand. He tried to pay her. She wouldn't take it. She told him worth doesn't argue, it just waits, and left him standing in his own Bottomland, turning the phrase over like a stone he'd found in a field he thought he knew. She had meant to tell Odette about all of it in a way, and the not being able to tell her was the shape grief took in Marlee's life those years. A hollow at the center of every good day, the person she most wanted to show a full egg basket to being the one person who couldn't see it. But there was another loss coming, one she didn't see until it was nearly on her, and it belonged to Cleora Basque, the old postmistress on Tinsmith Road, who had wept the first day and then told her everything about Asa. Cleora was the last person alive who had known both Asa and Odette in their prime, the last living memory of the man whose note started all of it. And when Cleora took sick that 4th winter, Marlee drove out to sit with her often, bringing eggs, and sometimes bringing the notebook, and reading Cleora the entries the way you'd read someone the news. Cleora, near the end, told her the last piece of the story, the piece Odette had never spoken of, which was that Asa Rue had bought the flooded bottom himself in 1955 for almost nothing, believing exactly what Marlee had come to believe, and that he had been building toward the very thing Marlee had built when his heart quit in 1968, and that Odette, in her grief, had lost the bottom to the county for taxes she couldn't pay alone, and had spent the rest of her life keeping just a handful of ducks on her own dry edge because she could not bring herself to keep more on ground that was no longer theirs. It was, Cleora said, the great sorrow of Odette's life that she'd let Ace's bottom go, and that she'd never told Marley any of it directly because she hadn't wanted to lay a debt on the girl. But she'd left the note where Marley would find it. She'd left the ducks. She'd left the door open, Cleora said, and trusted that a girl with her stillness would walk through it. Cleora died in February, 4 years almost to the day after Odette, and Marley buried her with the whole town there, and understood, standing at the grave, that the $200 she'd laid on the surveyor's truck had bought back something that had been lost for a generation, and that she had not so much started a thing as finished one. She did not tell the men on the porch any of that, because it was not their story, but the story got around anyway, the way stories do through Corbin Sleeth at the gas station. And by the 5th spring, the whole county knew that the flooded 40 on the Sable had once belonged to old Acerou, that the girl who'd bought it back for $200 was his widow's kin, and that she had proved out an idea a whole generation of practical men had laughed him out of. This changed the way people spoke of the bottom, and it changed the way they spoke of Marley, who was by then 23 and had a hired hand and a second helper, and a standing account with a restaurant that had grown famous partly on her ducks. When she finally expanded, and she did expand because the demand kept pulling at her, and she had learned to let it pull, she did it the same way she had done everything else, which was slowly, without debt, and without changing the thing that made it work. She bought the adjacent bottom from the county, another flooded strip nobody wanted, this time for $300, and she did not develop it or drain it or improve it in any way a banker would recognize. She simply extended her willow fences into it and let the ducks work it, and waited 2 full years for the silt and the birds to build it up the way they'd built the first. And only then did she add to the flock, and only by the number the new ground could feed in a lean year, a number she calculated in the notebook exactly as she'd learned to. She turned down 2 offers to go bigger with borrowed money, and she turned down a man from a large food company who wanted to buy her name and put it on ducks raised somewhere else, and she turned him down flat, because the whole point, she told Tobias afterward, was that you couldn't fake it, that the ducks tasted the way they tasted because of that specific black flooded ground and no other, and that the day she pretended otherwise the worth would evaporate and never come back. The town that had laughed at her came around the way towns do, not all at once and never quite with an apology, but steadily, until one day Marley realized that the flooded bottom everyone had called worthless was the single most valuable acre for miles, valued not by what it might be developed into, but by what it produced year after year on almost no money, the way Acerou had known it would. Pruitt Salk built a little cold case in the front of his grocery just for her eggs and put a hand-lettered sign over it. Iris Finn's pound cakes became locally famous, and she never once failed to credit the eggs. Burl Toomey, who had told her the bottom would grow nothing but mosquitoes and disappointment, took to leaning on the fence line most evenings to watch the ducks work, and one autumn he asked her gruffly whether she might spare him a few birds to start a little flock on a wet corner of his own, and she gave him a dozen and a page of notes and would not take his money either. Even Wendell Ox, who had converted his own low 40 to ducks with her help and was doing well at it, took to telling the story to strangers as though he'd believed in her all along, and Marley let him, because the truth had a way of standing up on its own without her having to prop it, and because she had never much cared who got the story right so long as the ground got worked. The men on the feed store porch, the ones who had watched her count out $200 and predicted she'd be gone by fall, grew old on that porch, and the ones who were left told the newer, younger men the story of the girl and the flooded bottom. The way you tell a thing you're proud to have witnessed, quietly editing out the part where they'd laughed. She kept the notebook the whole time, one after another, a shelf of them eventually, filling coffee cans and then a wooden box she built herself. And in the front of the first one, Asaru's note still rode, taped where she'd fixed it years before. The low water is the richest water. Don't let them talk you out of the bottom. The ink gone brown, but the words plain as the day he'd written them. On the day the county assessor came out to reappraise her land, routine business, the sort of thing that happens to everyone eventually, he sat at her kitchen table with his forms and worked his numbers, and when he was done, he told her, with the neutral surprise of a man who deals in valuations and had not expected to be moved by one, that the flooded bottom she'd bought for $200 was now the highest producing agricultural ground in the township on a per-acre basis, higher than Wendell Oaks's best dry quarter, higher than anything for 30 miles, and that he'd had to invent a category on the form to describe how it made its money. Marley thanked him and walked him to his truck and stood in the yard as he drove off, and then she walked down through the willow fences to the edge of the bottom in the long gold light of a September evening, and she stood there a long while, the way she had that first week, watching the ducks work the black water, the flock a moving gray tide across the richest acre in the county. And she did not say anything, because there was no one to say it to, and because the ground was saying it for her, and had been saying it patiently all along. She was 24 then, and she would keep at it for many years more, and the bottom would carry her the whole way. But the picture that stayed with the people who knew her was the one from that evening and the one from that first morning at the surveyor's truck, and the way the two mirrored each other, the girl standing quiet at the edge of the water in the gray light, seeing something no one else could see, and the same girl years later standing quiet at the edge of the same water in the gold light, having proved it so thoroughly that the proof no longer needed her. Asa Rue had known it in 1955 and died before he could show them. Odette had kept the flame lit for 54 years and never had the strength to build it up alone. It fell to Marley, who had come back not because she had a plan, but because it was the only ground that would hold her, to finish what the old man started. And she had done it the only way it could be done, which was slowly, with attention, without argument, letting the worth of the thing prove itself against every prediction, until the men who had told her she was setting her money on fire had lived long enough to warm their hands at the very fire she'd built. The bottom floods every spring still. The water still comes up over the low road, and every spring it lays down a fresh inch of the blackest silt in the county on the ground everyone once called worthless, and the ducks go back to work, and somewhere in a wooden box on a kitchen shelf, a note in a dead man's hand says what it has always said, which turned out to be true, which was true the whole time, waiting for someone patient enough to believe it. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever owned a thing, or loved a thing, or been a thing that the world was too quick to call worthless, send it to the person in your life who's being told right now that what they've got isn't worth the trouble, because they might need to hear that worth doesn't argue, it just waits. Tell me in the comments about the thing you refuse to give up on, the bottomland in your own life that everybody laughed at, because I read every single one of these and I want to know. And tell me where you're watching from, the town, the county, the country. I want to see how far Marley's ducks have carried this. Leave it below, and I'll be right there in the comments reading every word.